Okay. Good morning, everyone. Just getting some computer things set up. All right, there is the YouTube feed. And there is the link to the handout for today. All right, looks like we got a good strong signal. Let me get a secondary screen up here so I can see. Oh, all right. Oh, there's the. All right, that's YouTube. I'm going to bump him down to the end here. There we go. There's the Facebook feed. And I'm actually early today, which doesn't often happen. So I'll wait here a few minutes for people to roll in. All right. That's YouTube. Oh yeah, get that open. There we go. Yeah, we still got a few minutes. So. Mm. Those of you watching after the Sunday school hour, I do apologize. You'll have 5 minutes of watching me. Actually, when all's said and done, probably about 8 or 9 minutes of me killing time. So I do apologize for that. Good morning, Ken and Susan. Got a few minutes here before we ramp up, so settle in and we'll talk about history of the Bible canon. Yeah, we got about a minute before it's time to have a prayer and then get ready to roll. And looks like pretty pleasant weather here. A little bit humid for my taste, but I'm from Indiana, so I do like things a bit cooler than Georgia usually is. Good morning, Tammy. Glad to see you here. And Junior and Pat have joined us. This is good. This is good. All right, friends. So in the comment section, which usually is to the left of the video there in Facebook, you can find the handout that I'm working from today. Scroll down through. You can also find oh, thank you, Ken. Thank you. You can find a link to nathangilmore.com, my Sunday school lesson page. I've been storing my Sunday school materials there over the years, probably about 10 years now, give or take. So, I mean, this series that I've done here, as well as some other series that I've done at Bogart Christian Church and at other churches. Like I've said before, I store it there, first of all, so the people can use it. And it's funny, I often get a spike in visits to my website Saturday night. Do with that what you will. But this week is the fifth and last week of Family Stories. Just to recap a little bit, and we'll actually be recapping a few of these as we roll along here. Starting in the New Testament period, you've got a sense of authoritative scriptures. And remember, scripture simply means something that is written down, right? So you can, technically speaking, use the noun scriptures to refer to anything that is written, any book, any tablet, any monument, anything like that. Now, of course, the more narrow version of scripture, an authoritative religious text, is in effect there in the 1st century AD. And we looked at the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we looked at the gospel, no, not the gospel, the letter of Jude, there we go, to see how those scriptures function. And in Jude especially, we've got references to what we would know as the Old Testament, and we get references to what we know as Paul's letters, which were kind of on the verge of becoming scriptural at the time. And then we've got, books that we don't refer to as scripture anymore, Testament of Moses, books like that. But they're all just kind of used there, right? It's not until the 2nd century AD that people start making lists of authoritative books. By the 4th century AD, those lists are pretty much made solid. And remember, there in the 4th century, contrary to anything you might have seen in a Dan Brown movie or read in a Dan Brown novel, no one was hiding or destroying the other books. What was happening is that the list of books, the 27 books of the New Testament, the 47 books at the time of the Old Testament, those are the ones that you would hear read in church. And we talked about how there were really 3 lists of Bible books floating around. One of them was the Eastern Orthodox, so the Egyptian and the Romanian and the Greek and the Russian churches used one very long list. The Roman Catholics in Western Europe used another list, and to some extent in North Africa as well, used another list, and it is the 27 books we know as the New Testament, plus the books that would have been in the Greek Septuagint. And then the synagogue, the Jewish assembly, used a list that is the 39 books that we know as the Old Testament. All right. Then when you get into the age of printing and the age of the Protestant Reformation, you get another list of books that emerges that includes all of the books from the Latin Vulgate, but it rearranges them so that some of those books, called the Apocrypha, are moved over to, where are they moved to? They're moved to an appendix, often between the Old and New Testament, sometimes after the New Testament. All right. Now, when we talk about the English Bible, I'm going to recap some of the places that we've already touched on as we rolled through here, but I'm also going to go ahead and say that if you are listening in on Facebook, feel free to pose whatever questions you have, make whatever comments you want to make. And that extends to while I'm teaching the lesson and also afterwards, because I'll get a notification that the comment has appeared on the post, and I can try to answer it, even if you make if you pose the question or make the comment on Monday or Tuesday of this week, I'll still be able to get to it. But when we talk about the Christian mission to the island that we now call England, back then it would have been called Britain, we're talking about monks who would have been Latin speaking first and foremost. So these are missionaries from Rome. The modern Italian language really hasn't developed yet, and so when they come to the island, they speak Latin as their native language. Now, when they get there, one of the things they do pretty readily, because this is what missionaries do in the ancient world and in the modern, is they learn the local language, they learn English. And one of the things they realize is that in Britain, pre-Christian Britain, there isn't really, or no, pre-Christian England at this point, the Anglo-Saxons, which is another pagan tribe from Central Europe, has invaded, so they are English speaking. They're not Celtic speaking, but they realize that there is an elite class called the Druids who are able to communicate in writing through runes, but that there is no widely used written language there on the island. So what they do is they take a lot of those characters that are runic characters, and by the way, by runes we mean basically sacred markings that you usually find on monuments and religious structures, but aren't necessarily used for more everyday communication like business or education or things like that. It is exclusively for religious use. So they take some of these characters, some of these letters, and they match them up with the Latin alphabet, and we get something like what we know as the English alphabet. And this is, roughly speaking, the 5th century BC, and this is the beginning of what we know as written English. And during this period, these missionaries also, again, for the sake of their missionary activity for preaching the gospel among these peoples of this island called England, they develop English language versions of the Psalms and the Gospels and so on and so forth. Now, if you go to a Google search and search for Old English Gospel, Old English Psalms, you will discover that for us here in the 21st century, that version of English is very much a foreign language. All right. And in fact, as many of you know, I teach Old English for foreign language credit over at Emmanuel College. And it is a foreign language. I mean, it takes a lot of discipline and it takes a lot of time to learn how to read it, even as a lot of the structures are very recognizable in modern language. All right. So then, as we move on forward into the what gets called the High Middle Ages, the 12th century, the 13th century, the 14th century, we start to get, first of all, the increasing power of the Bishop of Rome, who we know as Il Papa, or the Pope. And as a result, these missionary Bibles that are really all over Europe and, on into West Asia and North Africa, they start to become suspect. All right. And the reason is that if you have native language Bibles, then people don't respect the Latin speaking priests and therefore the hierarchy that eventually leads up to the Bishop of Rome as an ultimate authority. And so it's during this period that you get some suspicion of these missionary common language Bibles. Now, it's not until really the 14th century that you get outright bans on English Bibles, and this is when someone named John Wycliffe has an English translation of the Bible made. We call it Middle English. They would have called it just English. And, as they begin to use this, understandably, when people can read it for themselves and understand it without the interpretation of an officially sanctioned priest from the Church of Rome, they don't really start to do anything. What they stop doing is regarding the priest as a necessary intermediary for encountering the God who meets them in these writings. Okay. And so, I mean, you get, a lot of battles over that that really lead up to the introduction of Protestantism in England. All right. And that's where our new material is going to start. In the 1500s, which is the 16th century AD, you get the introduction of Calvinist ideas into North England in the person of John Knox. You get generally Protestant, although not as strongly connected to Geneva, ideas introduced into England in the characters of, and I've got to look at my cheat sheet here, Miles Coverdale and William Tyndale. All right. Now, Coverdale and Tyndale take advantage of the new technology. Churches have always been interested in using new technology called the printing press, and they produce their own English Bible. And, understandably, the hierarchy of Rome is concerned about this. Now, at the time, there was a king on the throne named Henry VIII. You might have learned about him in a history class somewhere. And during the early part of his reign, he was a bitter enemy of Martin Luther. And they wrote nasty things about each other. King Henry actually wrote treatises and commissioned treatises condemning the heresy of Lutheranism and then Protestantism. And so the church in Rome awards him the title of Defender of the Faith. And this is, this makes him a counterpart to King Philip of Spain, who receives the title Defender of the Church. All right. Now, the tricky bit here is that much later on, the Church of England, starting with Henry VIII, we'll get to that in a moment, breaks with the Church of Rome. But the king or the monarch in our day retains that title, Defender of the Faith. So if you look at the film footage of Queen Elizabeth II's coronation, one of the things they declare about her in that ceremony is that she is Defender of the Faith. Well, that dates all the way back to Henry VIII, and it was originally a Roman Catholic title. Anyway, here's how Henry VIII plays into this. During that time, he realizes that, Protestantism is a danger. He writes against it, so on and so forth. Later on, one of two things happens, or actually at least two things. One possibility is he has a genuine religious conversion to the new Protestant Christianity. The other one is that he realizes that his family line, the Tudors, is not going to be able to stay on the throne if he doesn't have an heir, and his wife is not having any sons. Whichever one is the case, and people have been litigating that one for 500 years, he breaks with the Church of Rome, keeps the title Defender of the Faith, though, and declares himself the head of the Church of England. Now, he claims that because, the bishops in the Church of England do have apostolic succession, which all of the churches of the bishop of the Church of Rome have, that they retain that apostolic succession, and therefore they, the Church of England, are as ancient as the Church of Rome. Okay? Now, in this capacity, this is where he comes back into our Bible story. King Henry has a Bible commissioned. It gets to be called the Great Bible. And honestly, it isn't that great when it comes to the quality of the translation, the quality of the manuscripts used, so on and so forth. All right. But for the first time, you have not a renegade Bible like the Wycliffe Bible or like the Tyndale Bible, but instead you have an official crown commissioned Bible in England. All right. Now, when Henry VIII dies, he still doesn't have an heir. No, he does. He has a 9-year-old son who takes the crown and then dies pretty quickly thereafter. So his daughter, Mary, becomes the Queen of England. All right. Now, if you've ever heard of Bloody Mary, either the historical figure or the tomato juice based mixed drink, that's named after Henry's daughter, Mary. When she takes the throne, she remains a very devout Catholic. And so a lot of the scholars who were involved with the Great Bible are driven into exile, and they go to the most Protestant place on earth there in the 1500s, namely Geneva, Switzerland. All right. Now, there in Switzerland, these English-speaking Protestants in exile commission their own Bible. And one of the things about Switzerland is a lot of the best scholars in Europe, because they have converted to this new, not Protestant Christianity, Protestant Christianity. Good morning, Ron. Because they have converted to it, they have some of the best Greek manuscripts, some of the best Hebrew manuscripts in all of Europe. And so this team, realizing that even here in exile, which is a very bad luck thing, they have access to manuscripts that they never would have had in England. They get to work on creating a new English translation. And it is called, appropriately enough, the Geneva Bible. It's published in 1560, and it makes its way to England in the 1570s. And this is the Bible, incidentally, that the separatist pilgrims take across the Atlantic to Plymouth Rock in 1620. This is the Bible that Shakespeare quotes when he quotes the Bible in his plays. This is, at least according to legend, and I'm gonna put an asterisk next to this one because it might be legend, but according to the legend, this is the Bible upon which George Washington was sworn in as the first president of the United States. Now, why is that Geneva Bible important in that respect? Because he didn't want to be sworn in on a King James Bible, according to the legend. Now, Is there evidence of this? Yes, but it's tenuous. I still like the story. All right. Um, but this Geneva Bible becomes wildly popular, and it becomes dangerous to these Tudor monarchs, and then later on, when James the First of England takes the throne as the first Stuart monarch, he considers it especially dangerous because the text of the Bible is a very, very good English translation. And in fact, I have a facsimile edition of the 1560 Geneva Bible. I used it in my doctoral dissertation because my dissertation was on Spenser and Shakespeare and Milton, three English poets there from the 17th century who were kind of in that transition moment between the Geneva Bible and the Bible that came after. You probably know which one it is. Actually, I just said it a minute ago. But in the margins of the Geneva Bible, there were many lessons, if you will. It was kind of like a modern study Bible. All right. And what was dangerous about it is, for instance, in 1 Samuel, when the people of Israel asked for a king, and, Yahweh says to Samuel, "They have not rejected you, Samuel. They have rejected me." In the margins, it says, any people on earth that takes as their ruler a king rather than a magistrate is rejecting God. Well, you can see how that would be a little bit dangerous for someone who is a king, right? Likewise, in other places, when kings are overthrown, in Isaiah, when it says that God has thrown down the king of Babylon, there are marginal commentaries there as well that say that not only does God throw down bad kings, but also it is the duty of the faithful to be God's instrument in throwing down bad kings. So you can see, once again, how someone like James the First would find this a little bit dangerous, right? Probably more than a little bit. And so he has a Bible commissioned, and, King James, what do you know? He simply calls it the Old and New Testaments of the Christian Bible, translated from the Greek and Hebrew into English. That's a little bit unwieldy, so eventually it comes to be known as the King James Bible. Now, the Geneva Bible, actually, let me back that up. The Great Bible, the Geneva Bible, the Bishop's Bible, and the King James Bible, all right? All four of these Bibles, they all have those books that are called the Apocrypha in them. They all have in common that they move them to a section away from the other books of the Old Testament, all right? So we still have those four Bibles floating around in Europe, right? And in Asia and in Africa, okay? The Synagogue Bible, the Eastern Orthodox Bible, the Latin Vulgate Bible, and now the Protestant canon with the Apocrypha separated off from the Old Testament, okay? It's really not until the 18th century, the 1700s, that you start to get Bibles printed without those apocryphal books in them, all right? Odds are, if we looked at the Bibles that most of us own, and I own a few of them, most of those Bibles don't even have those apocryphal books printed in them. Now, I've got at least 4 Bibles that have those books printed in them. But, I also have a master's degree in biblical studies, so I own probably upwards of 20 Bibles. All right. It's a bad habit. I'm not gonna say I'm proud of that fact. But I do have reasons for owning the Bibles I do own. All right. But there in 1611, you get really a stabilization of the Bible that lasts for a good long time. And once again, you do get an English translation of the Latin Vulgate called the Douay-Rheims Bible. They're also in the 17th century. So you do have a Catholic English Bible floating around Europe alongside Protestant English Bibles. You also get, translations that Jesuit and Protestant missionaries are making all around the world. But as far as the English Bible is concerned, you pretty much have the standard version or the King James version. It goes by both names. All the way up until, the 1800s, all right? So it's about a 300-year span. Not the same length of stability as the Latin Vulgate from roughly the 4th century to roughly the 14th century, but still a pretty good run, all right? Then, when you get the turn of the 20th century, you really get what I call the Bible boom, okay? And the Bible boom doesn't begin in the 20th century. It begins in the late 19th century. When a scholar named Philip Schaff, who is mainly a church historian, but he's also a theologian, also a Bible scholar, very much a teacher of many talents. He gets a group of scholars together in America, and realizing that, archaeologists, largely from the Napoleonic Wars forward, which is to say, a good 200 years after the translation of the King James Bible, have discovered all kinds of ancient libraries, right? In monasteries, in caves, just all over the place in Northern Africa, Western Asia, to some extent in Eastern Europe. And, we have much, much better materials for translating the Bible now. He commissions a new translation of the Bible. Now, they still stick pretty closely to the linguistic traditions of the King James Bible. It still sounds very King James, but a couple important differences. One of them is, they are starting to incorporate differences in manuscripts, right? So there'll be a word different here, a word different there. So what they will do is they will use the updated scholarship. They will put in the main text the word or the phrase that is most likely, and then in a footnote, they will put, okay, there are manuscripts that have this, but they seem to be more recent manuscripts, and this might be someone filling in a blank that was there. All right. So one thing, and I should have written some of these verses down, but for instance, in the Gospel of Mark, I think it's the 10th chapter, but don't quote me on this. In most modern Bibles, there will be a verse missing. All right. And this is why in the 17th century, when the King James Bible is being printed, there is a printer in Paris named Stephanus, and his great invention there in the about 500 years ago. Actually, I misspoke there. It was in the 1500s, the 16th century. His great invention is Bible verses. So he starts numbering not just the chapters of the Bible, but also individual verses. All right. Well, I mean, they kept the old numbering because that's how people know their Bibles by that point. But Schaff's team omitted that verse because they had discovered manuscripts that they had good reasons to think were actually older than the ones that the King James translators used that didn't have that verse. So their theory is that what happened is, you have a break in the story, and what the translators did in those ancient monastic scriptoria is they wrote a marginal note, but whoever copied it next just copied the marginal note as if it were part of the text. All right. This does happen when you have hand copying. Okay. And so this version arrives on bookshelves in bookstores in 1901. They call it the American, back that up. They call it the revised version. Okay. Then what you get in the book selling world is they start to sell it in England, but they want to advertise that, this is using the best American scholarship because at the time, Harvard and Yale and Princeton have much better research departments in religious studies than England does at the time. England catches up, by the way. And the booksellers label it the American Standard Version. All right. So if you look at an American Standard Version Bible today, what you're going to see is, a Bible that reads a lot like the King James. It still has kind of that archaic sound to it. It still has the these and the thous. Wherever the name of the Lord appears in the Old Testament, they translate it as Jehovah rather than making it Lord in all caps. So it's very much a product there of the late 19th century. All right. Now I got to look here. In 1952, I had to look to make sure I got the name right. A team goes to make another revised version because, again, think about what has happened between 1901 and 1952. We talked about this in week 1, that discovery at Qumran, right? The Dead Sea Scrolls. So all of a sudden you have these resources, very, very ancient resources that just weren't available to the American Standard Version team. And so they make another translation. They also modernize the language a little bit, and they market it as the Revised Standard Version. All right. So now, just in English Bibles, you have the King James Version, which is very much an English Protestant version, the Douay-Rheims, which is an English Catholic version. You have the American Standard Version, which is, based on the modern scholarship available in 1901. And then you get the Revised Standard Version, which is based on scholarship from the 1940s, all right, and especially the Dead Sea Scrolls, okay? Now, at this point, this is post-war America. America's book publishing industry undertakes probably its most successful and most lucrative period in the history of book publishing. And so you really do get a boom of Bibles in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. If you look at the handout there, you'll see some of the examples there, right? And I've got to look at it because I don't remember all these years, right? So first of all, the Council of American Bishops, which is a Roman Catholic organization, commissions a Bible that very intentionally breaks with the King James tradition of translation, and it's called the Jerusalem Bible. And what's notable about it is the first English Bible since I got to make sure I got this right, the Wycliffe Bible, there we go, to put the books that we call the Apocrypha back into their original Septuagint order. So, for instance, instead of the book of Baruch being in an appendix away from the other books of the Old Testament, the Jerusalem Bible puts it right next to Jeremiah, which is where it would have been in the 600s AD, right? The book of Ben Sira is right next to Proverbs. The books of the Maccabees are right after the books of Chronicles, and so on and so forth, right? I mean, so what you get is an English Bible that, like I said, sounds very different from the King James Bible when you read it out loud. And it is there so that, they're in the 60s. You think about what's happening in the Catholic Church. It is the Second Vatican Council, and it is the renewal, really, of common language worship. This is where, the bishops of the Roman Catholic Church convene. And one of the things they decide is to vastly expand masses in modern English, modern Spanish, modern French, modern German, modern languages more broadly. And so to accompany that, they commission this Jerusalem Bible that is going to be, an English Bible that can be read at those services. Okay. At the same time, you have in America some projects that are trying to bring the Bible to the people, so to speak. In 1966, you have a single author, and I didn't write the author's name down, I apologize, but you can punch it up on Wikipedia, the Living Bible. Someone basically takes the King James Version and just rewords it, all right? So there's no direct contact with the Greek or the Hebrew here, but it is a modernized version, and it sells wildly, all right? This is actually one of the first Bibles that I own, the Living Bible, and it reads very much like a 1960s translation, right? I'm sure I've told the story to some of you that when in the Gospel of Mark, Herod is at his palace and gathers the people for debauchery. The Living Bible says that he gathers them for a stag party, which I think is just great. This is also the same time, by the way, that Eugene Peterson, pardon me, actually goes to the Greek and Hebrew languages. He has a PhD in Semitic, he's dead now. He had a PhD in Semitic languages, and he created a very modern sounding 1970s translation called The Message. All right. Now, one of the errors that people make is to call The Message a paraphrase because it sounds kind of like the Living Bible. It's actually not. It is a translation. All right. The difference between those two is not how modern they sound. That's not the criterion. But a translation begins with your Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic texts and goes from there into whatever the target language is. A paraphrase begins with a pre-existing target language translation, in this case English, and then creates a second book not based on the Greek and Hebrew, but based on that earlier English translation, right? So the Living Bible is a paraphrase. The Message is a translation. And during the same time, the Jewish Publication Society, they had already published their own English Bible in the early part of the 20th century. I think it was about 1917. But it was very much rooted in the American Standard Version that we talked about earlier. in the 1980s, I think, I got to look, yep, 1985, they commissioned a Bible that, like the Jerusalem Bible, sounds very, very different from the King James Bible, all right? And their Jewish Publication Society Bible is called the Tanakh, from the Hebrew abbreviation of Torah, Nevi'im, which is prophets, and Ketubim, which is writings. And they sell a very, very nice facing language edition that I own. The Hebrew over on the right side, the English over on the left side. And once again, I mean, they were very intentional about making it sound very different from modern English translation, or from the King James translation. All right. Now, two more that I want to talk about, and then we'll kind of wrap up. I'll take questions, of course, at any time. But right now, if you want to pose a question, make a comment, now's the time to do it. One of them is a translation that probably a lot of you have a lot of familiarity with. It is the New International Version. Actually, I'm going to do three of them. I just remembered that there's another one that I really need to talk about. Now, it's actually published in 1978 before the modern JPS translation. But the New International Version is interesting because it is very intentionally written to kind of thread the needle between what the Message is doing on one hand and what the Revised Standard Version is doing on the other hand. Revised Standard Version still sounds a lot like King James, although it's very much modernized. The Message is, I mean, a hippie Bible, right? I mean, it sounds like someone from the 1960s, 1970s telling you Bible stories, okay? The New International Version tries to thread that needle, and, you know, you all probably have heard it read, right? I mean, it is a Bible that very much sounds modern, you know, but it also still sounds like that King James Bible in its rhythms, in its gravity, things like that, right? Another Bible, which is the one that our Pew Bibles use, is the New Revised Standard Version, and it is translated largely as a response to the New International Version's popularity. One of the worries that they had is that the New International Version, there's no nice way to put this, they take some liberties with the Greek text, right, in order to save some embarrassment. So the most famous example, when Jesus is telling the parable of the mustard seed, he says the mustard seed is the smallest of seeds, and yet when it is full grown, it grows into a great bush in which the birds of the air may have their nests. Okay. Now, if you have studied biology, you know that there are hundreds of seeds, maybe thousands, that are smaller than the mustard seed. So the NIV translators knew this, and so they changed it up to have Jesus say the mustard seed is the smallest of your seeds, as if he were making a concession to the people there. But he was aware of, you know, 20th century botany. Well, he wasn't. That you know, the 20th century hadn't happened yet. Jesus was fully human, and so his scientific framework would have been a first century Palestinian Jewish scientific framework, right? And that's okay. I mean, you know, God didn't make a mistake having Jesus come to us in the first century. God was doing that on purpose, I'm pretty sure. All right. So the New Revised Standard Version tries to be modern like the New International Version. It tries to be serious like the New International Version, but it tries to keep in front of the reader a lot of the more difficult parts of the Greek text without trying to save embarrassment. Okay. Now, one thing about that is the New Revised Standard Version, knowing what it knows about Greek grammar, knows that, for instance, the plural form of certain nouns in Greek, they take either a masculine or a feminine form, but the masculine plural can include males and females, right? So in other words, Adelphi, which in the King James would have been translated as brothers, can also include women, right? So the New Revised Standard Version, whenever St. Paul or other writers uses Adelphi, it will translate that as brothers and sisters, okay? Which, you know, is what the word means. You can tell I'm kind of a partisan of this. This made some people angry, though. And so, a scant 20 years ago, in 2001, a new translation comes out. And by the way, I'm only hitting the high points here. There are other translations as well, but I'm looking at the time. I don't want to run us too late here. Called the English Standard Version. All right. Now, the English Standard Version tries to incorporate some of that more modern scholarship, just like the Revised and New Revised Standard translations do. It tries to be faithful with what's going on in the Greek text, just like the New Revised Standard Version does. But it makes a return to, first of all, using brothers to translate Adelphi. That's one of the big ones. But also in some other places, it really sharpens the points of certain passages that you could translate to be a little bit more ambiguous, or you could translate to reflect Calvinist doctrine. It always leans towards the Calvinist doctrine. Okay. So it is a Bible that is very, very much favored by conservative Baptists, conservative Presbyterians, those kinds of churches. All right. Now, I am up on time here, and I don't see any questions here. So let me kind of make a closing statement, and then we'll wrap up, and I'll see y'all over in Bogart. Okay. The English Bible, like I said, is a nice example. First of all, because it's the Bible that you and I read, but also because it has been through a lot of this history that we've been talking about together. And one thing I want to emphasize to you is that whether you are reading that English Standard Version Bible, which is the newest that we talked about, or whether you are reading an American Standard Version Bible or a King James Version Bible, whatever translation you are using, you can proceed with confidence that it is part of a conversation, an ongoing conversation about what is the content of the scriptures that God has handed down to us. All right. There's always going to be disagreements among people who translate, but those disagreements are always happening within the bounds of a working assumption, I'm going to call it that this is the sacred text of our Christian community that goes all the way back to actually before the Christian era. All right. Now, are there Bibles out there that, are specifically produced to counter, I'll put it that way, the Christian community? Sure thing there are. All right. But odds are you probably don't have a copy of those. Thomas Jefferson produced one. Isaac Asimov produced one. You will know if it is a Bible that is intentionally counter-Christian, if you will. All right. If you've got a New Revised Standard Version, English Standard Version, New International Version, King James Version, American Standard Version, any of these translations that we talked about today, you're going to be in good hands. All right. Now, can we have conversations about, should we translate it as the smallest of seeds or the smallest of your seeds? Yes, we can. Yes, we should. Yes, we will. Okay. But that conversation happens within the bounds of that community of the faithful. All right. I wanted to put that in there because sometimes you hear that, because there are differences among translations, therefore the Bible becomes utterly unreliable. It's just not that binary, right? Binary just means two choices, heads or tails. This one doesn't just have heads or tails. There's actually a bunch of variables, a lot of complexity, and it's a conversation, like I said, that's been going on really as long as we've had the Bible. All right. So I want to thank you all for jumping in. I'm going to go ahead and start wrapping up now so that I can get in the van and come over and try to run the video feed for service today. But next week, we're going to start on the book of Ephesians. So if you want to start reading on that, you can certainly do so. And I want to thank you for tuning in. I'm going to have a prayer here. If any questions materialize, I will answer them. And then I will see you all in some form for worship over in Bogart. Pray with me. God, as we wrap up this series and as we go from here, hopefully with some new questions and some new thoughts about the history of these books that we call Bible, I pray, God, that you would make us more aware of our position in that ongoing conversation. As people who read the English Bible and hear it read and hear it preached, we have certain responsibilities, and I pray that we would take those seriously, even as we continue in the faith, that you will guide us by means of this ongoing conversation about what the Bible is. God, I thank you for the people who have studied here with me, and I pray that as we go into this time of gathering around your table, that you would indeed remember us so that we might remember you, and it's through Christ we pray. Amen. All right, friends. I'm going to sign off, and I will see you Well, actually, hopefully you won't see me, because if so, I messed something up. But I'll be behind the camera, if you will, over in Bogart. Peace.